Luke Carver had seen his share of trouble on the frontier, but nothing like the day he found the dying gunman. The man was bleeding into the dust, mumbling about enemies close behind. Luke didn't know if he was an outlaw or a lawman, but leaving him would have been murder. So he hauled the stranger back to his ranch. By nightfall, Luke realized he'd made a mistake. Because that's when they came, 6 armed women, hard-eyed and silent, demanding shelter. And Luke learned the bleeding man in his bunk had a past that could get them all killed before morning. The sun was sinking low, painting the horizon in streaks of gold and crimson, when Luke spotted something on the trail ahead, a man sprawled face down in the dust, his shirt soaked through with blood. Instinct told Luke to keep riding. Trouble had a way of sticking to strangers like burrs to a saddle blanket, and this one looked like he'd dragged plenty of it behind him. But Luke was no man to ride past the dying. Not when there was still breath in their lungs. He reined in, boots hitting the dirt with a solid thump. Kneeling beside the man, he turned him over. The stranger's skin was pale, clammy, his breathing shallow. Blood seeped from a ragged hole under his ribs, spreading in dark, sticky patches across his shirt. A battered Colt revolver lay just out of reach, half buried in the dust. "You still breathing, stranger?" Luke asked, voice low but steady. The man's eyelids fluttered, revealing glassy, pain-filled eyes. "Don't, leave me here," he rasped. Luke hesitated, scanning the horizon. No sign of anyone, no dust trail from a pursuing posse. Still, his gut told him someone had put that bullet in the man, and whoever it was might still be close. "All right," Luke muttered, more to himself than the stranger. "But you'd better be worth the trouble." Grunting with effort, he lifted the wounded man onto his horse, careful to keep the revolver out of reach. Then he swung into the saddle behind him and spurred toward his ranch. The ride back was long and tense. The stranger moaned a few times, muttering names Luke didn't recognize, Clara, Evans, and once, clear as a bell, "They're comin'." By the time Luke crested the final rise, the sun was gone, leaving only a strip of dying light in the west. The silhouette of his ranch house stood against it, a lone shape in the wide emptiness. Inside, he carried the man to a spare bed and lit a lamp. Luke cleaned the wound as best he could, biting back a curse at the amount of blood. The bullet was still in there. He'd have to dig it out, and soon. The stranger stirred, grabbing Luke's wrist with surprising strength. "Don't tell Em I'm here," he whispered. "Don't tell who?" Luke asked. But the man's eyes rolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness. Luke stood for a moment, listening to the quiet tick of the clock on the mantel. Then he heard it, the distant rumble of hooves. More than one horse. Moving fast. He stepped onto the porch, peering into the dark. Out of the blackness, they appeared, a line of riders, all women, their silhouettes sharp against the starlit sky. They rode hard, skirts snapping in the wind, rifles slung across their saddles. One of them called out as they slowed before the porch. "We know he's in there, rancher. Hand him over, or we all come in." Luke's hand tightened on the doorframe. Whatever he'd just dragged out of the dirt, it wasn't just a wounded man. Luke's ranch sat in a lonely stretch of prairie, miles from the nearest neighbor. The only sounds were the wind rattling the loose boards and the low murmur of cattle out in the pasture. He laid the man on his bunk, the old mattress sagging under the weight, and set to work. The bullet had torn through the meat of Eli's side, grazing a rib. Luke cleaned the wound with what whiskey he had left, pouring a measure down Eli's throat to fight the shock. The stranger coughed, grimaced, and muttered something under his breath that Luke didn't quite catch. "Name?" Luke asked, keeping his tone flat. The man's jaw tightened like he was deciding whether to trust him. "Eli, just Eli." Luke nodded, neither surprised nor offended. Out here, men often gave only what they had to. The frontier taught a man not to dig too deep into another's business unless he wanted trouble. But as Luke worked, he couldn't shake the sense that Eli was dragging more than a bullet into his home. The weight of the man's silence, the scars along his arms, the way his fingers twitched like they were used to gripping a weapon, all of it spoke of a life lived on the dangerous side of the law. When the bleeding slowed and the bandage was tight, Luke stepped back. "You'll live. Long as you don't try anything stupid." Eli gave a faint, wry grin. "Ain't got the strength for stupid right now." Luke poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat in the chair opposite the bunk. The light from the lantern painted sharp shadows on the walls, making the room feel smaller. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing the smell of rain, and something else. Hoofbeats. Luke's head came up. It wasn't the slow, solitary clop of a single rider. This was a cluster, moving with purpose. He reached for his rifle, crossing to the window. In the distance, silhouettes crested the rise, half a dozen riders, all women. Wide-brimmed hats, rifles slung across their saddles, dust trailing behind them like a storm. They didn't slow as they approached. Luke glanced at Eli. The man's eyes were open now, sharp with something between fear and resignation. "They're here for me," Eli said quietly. It was just past sundown when Luke heard the sound, the steady, deliberate rhythm of hooves on hard-packed earth. 6 of them. He stepped out onto the porch, the evening air cool against his face, rifle resting easy in his hands. The last of the sun bled red along the horizon, turning the riders into dark shapes against the fading light. When they drew close enough for the lantern glow to catch them, Luke's eyes narrowed. 6 women, all with the look of the trail, dust clinging to their coats, hair wind-tangled, eyes sharp. Every one of them carried steel, pistols at their hips, rifles slung across their saddles. The one in front dismounted first. She was tall, with black hair braided tight down her back in a stance that said she wasn't in the habit of asking permission. Her gaze flicked from Luke to the door of the house, then back again. "We're coming in," she said, her voice low but firm. "We need shelter." Luke shifted his weight, not raising the rifle but not lowering it either. "Shelter from what?" Her expression didn't change. "From him." She jerked her chin toward the house. Luke's eyes narrowed. "Eli?" She gave one sharp nod. "That's the name he's using this week." From inside, the floorboards creaked. Luke didn't have to turn to know Eli had heard every word. "What's he done?" Luke asked. "That's a long story," the woman said, glancing toward her companions. "And we don't have the time to tell it standing out here." Behind her, the others dismounted, keeping their weapons close. They didn't move like ranch wives or homesteaders, more like scouts, fighters who'd ridden hard and wouldn't hesitate to use their guns. Luke felt the tension tighten in the air, the kind that made a man's trigger finger itch. From the doorway came Eli's voice, rough but steady. "You can tell him whatever you want, Mara. Doesn't change the truth." The black-haired woman, Mara, took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving Luke's. "The truth is, we're staying here tonight. Whether he likes it, or not." Luke's grip on the rifle tightened. Between the bleeding gunman inside and the armed women outside, it was clear he'd just stepped into a storm that wasn't his, but was about to become his problem. Inside, the women crowded into Luke's main room, boots thudding against the worn pine floor. Dust from their long ride hung in the lantern light. None of them removed their hats, and every eye was fixed squarely on Eli, who sat on the bunk with his back against the wall, bandaged shoulders stiff. The leader, Mara, stepped forward. Her voice was low but sharp enough to cut. "He killed a man who didn't deserve it. We aim to see him stand trial." Eli's jaw clenched, eyes narrowing beneath the shadow of his brow. "Trial?" His tone was bitter. "That man killed my brother in cold blood, and there weren't no judge or jury to stop him." A murmur rippled through the group of women, their hands never straying far from their gun belts. One of them, shorter but with a hard set to her jaw, spoke up. You expect us to believe you just happened to put a bullet in him for justice's sake? Eli's glare shifted toward her. I don't expect you to believe anything. But I buried my brother with my own hands. That's truth enough. The air felt heavy, like the stillness before a prairie storm. Luke stood between them, the firelight flickering across his face. He could feel the pull of 6 pairs of eyes on him, and Eli's too. You're on my land now, Luke said, voice firm. And nobody's pulling a trigger in my house. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the old mantel clock and the faint hiss of the lamp wick. Mara's gaze slid from Eli to Luke. We didn't ride 30 miles to play at threats. That man needs to answer for what he's done. And if I hand him over, Luke asked, what happens? A fair trial? Or a bullet behind the barn? No one answered right away. That told Luke more than their words could have. Eli's voice was steady, but there was a raw edge to it. They ain't the law, Luke. They're looking for their own kind of justice, the kind that leaves me in the ground before sunrise. One of the women spat into the fire, the hiss loud in the silence. Call it justice or call it payback, doesn't matter much to him now. Luke's hand hovered near his rifle, not in threat, but in readiness. This roof's mine, he said slowly, and while you're under it, you'll keep your guns down. That goes for both sides. Mara stared at him for a long moment, the weight of her decision hanging in the air. Finally, she nodded once, curt and reluctant. For tonight. But come morning, we're talking again. Eli leaned back against the wall, his breathing ragged but his eyes never leaving hers. Luke knew this was far from over. Morning light would bring more than just another day, it would bring a reckoning. They agreed to stay until morning, but the truce was uneasy, as brittle as old glass. The barn doors creaked shut behind the women, their boots scuffing over the hay-strewn floor as they claimed spots among the stalls. Luke made sure the latch was secure, though not locked. Locking them in felt too much like starting a fight. Back in the house, he kept his rifle propped against the wall within arm's reach. The lamp burned low, casting long shadows that crept across the plank floor. Outside, the wind carried faint murmurs from the barn, women's voices, clipped and sharp, like they were still chewing over the day's events. Eli sat at the table, his bandaged shoulder stiff, eyes following Luke's every move. When the wind quieted, he leaned forward, his voice no louder than the ticking mantel clock. You ought to know, Luke, that man I shot. He wasn't some harmless drifter. He was part of a gang that's been hunting me near on a year. Stole cattle, robbed wagons, killed folks who wouldn't give up their coin. And those women out there? He nodded toward the barn. They're blood kin to their leader. Sisters, cousins, maybe worse. This ain't about justice. It's about revenge. Luke didn't answer right away. He poured himself a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, watching the steam curl and vanish. That gang story true? He asked finally. Eli met his gaze without blinking. I got the scars to prove it. Still, Luke had seen enough lies in his time to know that truth could be dressed up to look just as dirty. He thought about the women's eyes, sharp, unflinching, full of purpose. They didn't look like they'd come all this way on a whim. The night settled thick around the house. Every so often, the barn door groaned in the wind, and Luke's hand twitched toward his rifle. The coffee sat untouched now. He didn't know who to believe. The bleeding gunman who'd stumbled onto his land, or the hard-eyed women who rode like they owned the trail. But one thing was certain, come sunrise, the cold light of morning might spill more than just shadows across his land. It might spill blood. And Luke had never much liked cleaning blood out of dirt. At dawn, the women filed into the yard, guns in hand. We're taking him, the leader said. Eli stood weakly in the doorway, Colt hanging at his side. Not without a fight. Luke stepped between them, his voice cold. Nobody's dying here today. Not while I stand. The standoff stretched, the only sound the wind. Finally, the leader lowered her gun. We'll ride on, she said. But if he's lying, Carver, you'll wish you'd let us take him. With that, they mounted up and rode into the rising sun. Luke turned to Eli. You're leaving, too. Today. Eli nodded. You saved my life. I won't forget it. As the hoofbeats faded, Luke stood alone on his porch, the prairie wide and quiet again. He'd given shelter to a bleeding stranger and faced down a band of armed women, and in the west, that was just another day you lived to see the next sunrise.